We're live and this is working. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mesa Zora. I am the Corporate Legal Accountability Program Manager at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And I'd like to very warmly welcome you to today's fireside chat about protecting labor rights in the age of the platform economy. Which we're organizing together with our partners at the International Transport Workers Federation, the ITF. So we have a really exciting hour ahead of us, during which we essentially aim to examine the human rights risks for workers that are associated with digitalization and the platform economy, and to discuss what kind of solutions are needed to protect the rights of workers in this context. So just to give you an idea of how we'll be spending the next hour together, so we'll take the first 30 to 40 minutes roughly to discuss some key issues and questions on this topic, and then keep roughly 15 minutes at the end of the session for questions and contributions from the audience. Now, let me just start by stating what might seem obvious, and that is that digitalization is posing a broad range of challenges in the workplace and to society more broadly. And one such example, of course, is the increasing collection and use of data to monitor and control workers, which creates new pressures in the workplace and new dangers to health and safety and working conditions. There are many more challenges, of course. We have, important questions regarding the traditional employment relationship and what that means for the protection of workers. And, there are numerous labor and human rights organizations around the world that are grappling in this context with key questions, such as what are the challenges and the human rights risks associated with digitalization and the platform economy? How might rights be protected from the potential negative impacts of digitalization? What are the human rights responsibilities of companies in this context? And what kind of alternative or rights-based solutions might there be in order to address these challenges? And here, essentially, to reflect on these key questions is my dear colleague, Dr. Victor Figueroa. Victor is the Future of Work Policy Advisor at the International Transport Workers Federation. And his work focuses on studying the impacts of new technologies on transport workers across the world. But before I turn it over to Victor, I thought we'd just begin by hearing from all of you, our dear audience from around the world, on where you think some of the key challenges might lie. So this is, I hope you will forgive me, this is the first time I'm using this technology, so I'm just making sure that we have the poll ready. So we're going to kick it off with a very quick poll, and would like to invite you to answer the following questions. One question. So what are the challenges that digital technology presents for workers and for society around the world? So you have 5 options here to click, and I'll just pause for a minute to give everyone the chance to answer the poll. Okay, so I can see that we're having some technical difficulties. We'll just give it a few seconds. You should be able to take the poll in just a minute. Okay, I'm just hearing that it may be a few minutes, actually. So yeah, we could return to it later, but I think Victor will give the answers away if we do. So perhaps I'll just give the audience a second to think quietly about this question of what you think the challenges are that are posed by digital technology for workers and for society as a whole. So I'll just give you guys a second to reflect on it, and then I'll hand it right over to Victor. I was going to ask Victor whether your answers resonated with what Victor has seen from his many years working in the field. But Victor, you can, I guess, then just guess what the audience may have said. So, Victor, I think I'll just, given that we have these technical challenges at the moment, perhaps you could illuminate and share with us some of the challenges that you've seen in this context.
Thank you, Marissa. I think it would be interesting to see the poll results. I have my suspicions around what might come up as the prime challenge identified by the audience, but I think the main thing here would be to note that over the years, there has been quite a strong narrative around technology and technology development. And a few years ago when I started this kind of work, that narrative focused very much on automation and the immediate threat of job losses. And then it's kind of moved into AI and the challenges posed by AI. So I think, that is, it would be interesting to see where the audience is at in relation to that kind of narrative. But for us, from our kind of experience, the challenges all derive from data, the characteristics of the use of data, and the scale of digitalization as it's happening across mainly the developed world, but also elsewhere today. And I think that scale is even more evident today after COVID, where we're seeing the introduction of more technological solutions to the problems raised by the pandemic. Now, before I go on, it's probably worth sort of defining digitalization. I know that specialists have many different definitions here, but I think for our purposes, digitalization is simply the process by which we use sensors in order to measure phenomena. The measurements are produced in ones and zeros in digital form, which can then be read by computers, and that information can then be analyzed and used in order to inform human operators or to control processes in some way. Now, I think if you look closely, you can see that this technology is spreading. It's already probably deeply penetrated in social terms in society. We have our mobile phones, which some activists call personal data transmitters. They track location, they potentially record all our communications, and on them we engage with social media platforms, which on one hand are a way of expressing ourselves, but on another, taken in aggregate, collectively, what they do is express the aversions, the desires, the consumption, the behaviors of a society as a whole. And so they allow some kind of measurement of society to be carried out. We're measuring ever more natural phenomena, ocean currents, the amount of plastics in the sea, temperatures, wind speeds, and so on. And we're also in our cities, measuring the flows that make up urban life. Passengers moving around a city, goods moving around a city, energy, water, sewage. All of these flows are essentially increasingly being measured. And I think what this means is that workplaces really are not excluded from this process. Workplaces are also increasingly being digitized. We are seeing sensors implanted into infrastructure, into vehicles, into equipment, into uniforms, and workers are being encouraged or forced to wear sensors, biometric sensors, location sensors, and so on. And what these do is really measure the work process, provide information on the work process. They also provide information about the individual worker. And this is something that is quite new. And this is an issue, I guess, because it's unprecedented, but also because all of this data, if we think about it, is a form of information. Information, once it's been analyzed and processed, can become knowledge. And knowledge, as we know, is a form of power, a latent form of power. So the question is, who gets to wield this power? And when we look at what's happening with digitalization at the moment, we see that it's fundamentally driven by private actors. And the transparency that it kind of creates around a process, because it measures that process. It measures every aspect of a process, or many aspects rather. That transparency is one way. So it's part of a power relationship in itself. And this creates an unfair situation. It can create an unfair situation in society between government and people, when a government can identify groups of people, perhaps opposition groups, before they even know that they're really an opposition group. But in the workplace, it can be used by managers and the employer in order to exacerbate the already unequal relationship that exists between the employer and the employee. So, if I give you an example that's quite realistic, I've interviewed many workers in different parts of the world about their experiences with technology, and this is something that comes up. A worker might be called into their manager's office, reprimanded about the amount of time that they spend away from their workplace, their work post, going to the toilet, say. And they would say, look, we've seen that you spend about 35% more time away from your workplace going to the toilet than the average worker in this company. And that this totals, almost 2 hours of lost working time over a month. And you have a couple of weeks to resolve this. Otherwise, we're going to take action, fire you and so on. What can the worker say in that situation? The worker has no access to the data itself. He can't question the data. She can't say, well, that sensor's malfunctioning. The clock is set wrong on it or whatever. The sensor also, or the data, it also doesn't take into account criteria that the worker may be very aware of. But because they're not being measured, they don't count in the process. So, for example, the worker might have a bad foot because they dropped a knife on it in the kitchen the night before. They might have a prostate problem that requires them going to the toilet more often. They might have a supervisor that collars them every time they go to the toilet to talk to them for 5 minutes about some aspect of work. If it isn't being measured, it doesn't matter. That's part of the unfair situation that is created by this. Moreover, the worker never has data going the other way. The worker can't see what the average amount of time spent in the toilet is. The worker doesn't know how long the manager spends in the toilet. And the worker has no influence over what is measured and what isn't measured. So there's a great deal of inequality embedded in the process of digitalization. And a related aspect to this is the way in which digital technologies, particularly algorithms and AI, reflect existing inequalities and prejudices in society. So in a sense, they're not objective. They are reflections of the society that produces them. So, for example, it's well known that algorithms reproduce gender and racial biases. And this is a huge problem for workers, but also for society more broadly. The recent cases from the United States are of, Black people being profiled as being more likely to commit crimes. But in relation to technology itself, this can have a series of, in the workplace, this can have a series of impacts, serious impacts on working conditions and on the lives and on the rights of workers. And so my argument would be that, as a tech philosopher wrote probably about 40 years ago about the first kind of wave of computer development, that 80% of the benefits of a technology derive from the social and organizational changes made around that technology. So, for example, it's if you were to bring autonomous vehicles into a city and you didn't do any work around, thinking about how this would impact other processes, how else the transport might be organized, then you'll only get 20% of the benefit, roughly, from this new technology. In order to get the whole benefit, you have to look at the system itself. And I know that this is something that different organizations are looking at, systemic analysis and so on. But I think that at the moment, as societies, we're generally concerned with looking at the technologies themselves, at the applications of the technologies themselves, and not at the social and organizational changes that are required to balance, effectiveness, safety, human rights, and so on. And so one important challenge for all of us is to understand not just the obvious challenges that relate to job losses or health and safety, perhaps, around highly automated machines, but also to understand these other social issues and the power dynamics and the way they might be affected, and the way that they require new checks and balances, new responses, in order to be able to resolve these hugely problematic inequalities that derive from digitalization in the type of society that we live in today.
Indeed. And Victor, if I may just ask perhaps a follow-up question to that. I think these were really important points and compelling examples. And I was wondering if you might have additional examples in terms of, what are some of the human rights risks that workers are facing. And you've already alluded to several of them. But I know when we were discussing this, you had some additional compelling examples of algorithms that fail to take into consideration local context and culture, for instance. And related to that, I was wondering, in addition to these human rights risks, are there any benefits at all resulting from digitalization? Over to you, Victor.
It's a good question. I mean, I think the answer would be it depends. The benefits depend on what the data is used for and how it's regulated. If we decide that occupational health and safety or pay and conditions, protecting what we would call decent work conditions, is a prime task for digitalization, then that is what it would produce. It would produce that outcome. It would improve our measurement of these issues and our ability to resolve them. However, what we see in the economy as it exists at the moment is that this technology is being used in order to control processes much more effectively, and control in the sort of in the sense of being able to understand it, reorganize it in various ways, whether that's in introducing automated or autonomous machinery, or whether it's simply forcing people to work much harder, squeezing more out of the existing workday. And this is something that I think many of the people in the audience presumably have been working from home, in the last few months. And, we've seen an uptick in sales of what we would consider surveillance technology, which can be embedded in work laptops and so on, and which can measure how long it takes you to answer an email, whether you're looking at the screen and so on. This is a form of that type of control of labor using technology. Now, in the sectors that we represent at ITF, what we see is workers under huge pressure from algorithms, particularly productivity algorithms, which are designed with no input from the workers themselves. They have no say on what the criteria are that they're being measured on. And this causes huge problems. So that's one aspect of it. Another is that the way in which automated technology is brought in is done without consideration for the workers around it. In the sense of, I remember some Amazon workers that I interviewed in Spain last year, and one of them gave a very vivid description of what it was like to work around the robots that bring the workers the shelves from which they pick the products that go into the boxes and then are then sent out to the customers. And in order to ensure the safety of the workers, they are caged. So they are put in a cage and the robots drive around and bring them the shelves. There's a productivity rate which they have to abide by. And, that's what they do. They're not meant to work in there for longer than, I think it's 9 hours at a time, and no more than a couple of days a week. But this particular person had been in the cage for almost 2 months. And when I asked her what that felt like, she said she wanted to die at the end of every day. I mean, that's pretty grim. And the anecdote is relevant because being made to work in a cage has an immense psychological impact. It's a psychosocial impact of automation. The job hasn't gone. There's a job still there, but the job has become dehumanized. There's very little agency in it, and every aspect of it is being measured. So there's an additional psychological burden from knowing that you're being watched the entire time, not by a human being, but by a computer, and knowing that the process that is assessing you is automatic. There's no redress there. You can't appeal against an algorithm. And actually, the workers that had tried to do this, the union that had tried to do this, was told on one occasion that they needed to speak to people in Prague. On another occasion, they needed to speak to people in Seattle. And the digitalization of that process meant that there was a dispersal of responsibility, which meant that there was no one who could actually remedy that problem. And so, the work has the additional burden of knowing that they can't change that situation, which is pretty horrific. US workers in the same company, and the reason I use Amazon is because it's a leading company. It's using a lot of technology. So a lot of these things are probably going to bleed in, they're going to feed in to other areas of the economy once Amazon has kind of tested them and shown that they actually work. And the workers were being that had their productivity rate increased, and it didn't take account of the fact that it was Ramadan, and so that we saw a wildcat strike there. Now, the point of that is that these algorithms are being written in one place, and they are assuming a set of criteria as if all human beings are the same. And we all understand that human beings are immensely diverse, and that averages, even in particular societies, are very different. Dutch people are, I think the average is they're 6'1" or something. English people are, 5'8". And, that is very relevant if you work in a warehouse, by the way. You've got to reach the top shelf. Like how often you can do that kind of depends on how tall you are, how hard it is for you to bend over, all of these things. So we have problems in relation to algorithms and digitalization in that they apply a uniform criteria, a uniform standard, which doesn't take into account issues which can be immensely important, whether you have repetitive strain injury, whether you're on your period, whether you're fasting. The algorithm doesn't care. And at the moment, without any kind of regulation that forces these companies either to admit liability themselves or that regulates this in some way, you've got no redress, no solution to that problem.
Yeah. And I think, Victor, just to that point of responsibility, including liability, I mean, that's a really interesting and important one, right? I mean, in addition to what you were saying about kind of the human rights implications of health, safety, human dignity, but also the psychosocial consequences you noted. I think that kind of segues nicely into the next question we wanted to discuss with it, which is, well, what kind of responsibilities do companies who use that kind of digital technology have, including under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights? If you could just elaborate a little bit on that, please.
Okay, well, as you know, I'm not a lawyer myself. So you'll have to forgive if there's any playing hard and loose or fast and loose with with legal terms here. As far as I understand it, those guidelines require companies to prevent, mitigate, and remediate human rights harm. And there are a lot of rights that therefore should be considered when we're looking at the impacts of digitalization. A lot of them come under what we call occupational safety and health, which is musculoskeletal problems, psychological impacts, social impacts, which have an impact on health. So they're not just direct safety impacts, but they're about creating the context so that you can work in safety and securing the knowledge that everything has been done to make your workplace safe. And so when when we look at that and we look at how workers who are being controlled effectively by an algorithm are suffering harm, we can see that that needs to be incorporated. So, for example, as I've just described, the productivity algorithms used by Amazon, but not just Amazon, other companies, they create physical injuries. They create psychological harm by isolating workers, breaking up the social aspect of work. This is something that, for example, bus drivers have talked to me about. The scheduling technology that is used to make sure that your buses arrive regularly, with a 2-minute interval, means that at the end of each route, the bus drivers often are forced to just jump on the next bus with no time to have a cup of tea, to have a cigarette, or to have a chat, or more importantly, go to the toilet. And so we're seeing people who are working an 8-hour day, sitting down, no toilet access, and suffering health problems as a result of it, suffering psychological problems from the loss of the fun element of work as well. That's in public transport. But in Uber, digital telematics, which is essentially the use of sensors to measure the car's performance and location, alongside the algorithmic management embedded in the app, creates significant psychological stress on the drivers, and it actually, forces them to act in ways that can damage their health. Instead of allowing them to work an 8-hour day with breaks, they're forced to work 12 hours with long periods of sitting in a car, which is not healthy for anyone. And so I think that, combined with the fact that these algorithms and even the data that sits behind the algorithms can contain biases that negatively affect women, ethnic minorities, and indirectly, religious and minorities and so on. There are health and safety implications that don't just derive from their kind of potential for discrimination, but also from issues such as what we might call cybersecurity. When I'm thinking back to a recent report on port automation by a security company, it's basically saying that there's no way we can guarantee the cybersecurity of a networked port, and this has implications for the operation of the port, but it also has environmental implications, because you could, for example, see a situation where a ship carrying hazardous chemicals or radioactive waste or whatever would be the unloading would be compromised by a cyber attack, and obviously the workers involved would be in great danger. Never mind the community that is usually around a port. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there are a series of responsibilities here for companies. There's a responsibility to prevent harm, whether it's harm potentially through the operation of an autonomous vehicle or a robot. There's or to prevent the harm perhaps done by an algorithm, or the harm that it potentially resides in digitalizing a process without being able to guarantee that process remains safe. And so from our perspective, although digital companies, which is kind of what we're calling all these tech companies, they may not be direct employers of our workers, but they still have a responsibility between them and the direct employer to protect the human rights of the workers engaged in a process, including privacy, including the right not to be discriminated against, but also things like ensuring that they're able to work decent working hours, not having to work 50 hours a week, say, in order to, or 70 as some Uber drivers do, in order to make ends meet. That the use of data to control has to be mediated by the rights of the people who are being controlled. Things like the right to disconnect. All of these things, I think, mean that there's an added burden on digital companies. to ensure that they do their part to prevent, mitigate, and remediate harm. And that means they need appeals processes. They need, the algorithms need to be vetted. The use of machinery needs to be tested for discrimination, for biases, and so on. Because in a digitalized economy, it's not just the direct employer that is creating the working conditions. It's also this kind of at one remove conditioner of labor that is doing this. And so, that's in many of our sectors. In some areas, there's an additional issue, which is, relates to the gig economy, to these platform companies like Uber, Lyft, and so on. Because I think perhaps their responsibility to prevent, mitigate, and remediate harm could be understood as meaning that they have to recognize that the people that work for them are employees. Maybe not, in the traditional absolute sense of exercising direct control, but of exercising indirect control through algorithms that mean that they are effectively employers. And so, I think that is another area that incorporates even gig economy companies into this sort of framework of prevention.
That's super helpful, Victor. Thank you. And also thank you for, making that last point. I think it's a critically important one around the, exercising direct versus indirect control and what that means for, these new labor relationships that are emerging, as you rightly say, in the platform and gig economies. And, perhaps if I could just piggyback off that, I mean, if we look at very recent developments in the UK just last week, and using the very example you made about Uber. So for those of you who might not know, or those of us watching who might not know, Uber drivers in the UK and the Couriers Union brought last week a precedent-setting new lawsuit against Uber to demand access to their data, to essentially uncover Uber's algorithms that they use to control and shape the work of the workers, as Victor, you have very eloquently elaborated on earlier. And the UK Supreme Court in the same week has also heard arguments in the final stage of a long pending case on driver employment classification. So I think these are really important kind of cases that are happening. They also show, in a way, worker power, or workers around the world who've been misclassified as independent contractors as opposed to employees. Who are using essentially the courts to assert their core labor rights. And if I may just make a quick point on that, and then I'll hand back over to you, Victor, who's really the expert on all of these issues, but I think it's worth just mentioning, and I'll make sure to share our report on the issue at the end of our session today. But what we've seen around the world is that gig economy platforms such as Uber, Lyft, etc., routinely misclassify their workers as independent contractors to maximize profit, which also means that these workers, as you rightly mentioned earlier, Victor, don't have access to social protections and labor rights, and they end up carrying out low-paid, precarious work without collective bargaining power, etc. And that companies also actually actively undermine workers' rights and access to justice. And we see all over. In all of these contracts, we see what are they called? I'm escaping the, what's the word? Arbitration agreements, etc. But the lawyer, I'll put those aside. But just to say that companies are not exactly playing a very positive role when it comes to workers' endeavors to really assert their labor rights. I was wondering if, you've come across that in your work as well. And if you could just elaborate on, your experience with these kind of, even on the litigation front. I'm sure you've talked to workers who have tried to assert their labor rights through litigation. Do you have any thoughts on litigation versus negotiation? Where are we today?
I think, there should be a kind of concern around one aspect of this kind of gig economy and the misclassification, as we would call it, of workers in that sector. and that is that it pushes us away, it obliges us to abandon, or because we're not recognized as trade unions, as partners to be negotiated with, it forces us into a situation where we have to litigate in order to defend our rights. And this is, not a space of dialogue. This is a space of confrontation. And I think that, in most countries in the world, in many countries in the world, the tripartite, the element of social dialogue has been crucial to developing economically and to providing a decent standard of living for workers, and it's kind of the bedrock of a decent society, really. And so, if we're moving away from that into a situation of confrontation, then that should be something of concern, not just for the workers involved, but also for society as a whole. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that, Victor. And there are so many follow-up questions to be asked, but I'm very mindful of time, and we have quite a few other compelling and exciting questions to get through. So I'll just move on, but I'm sure our audience will have some questions on that for you at the end of the session. I was wondering, essentially, it's not just companies that apply digital technology, right? So there are many cities that are doing that as well, that are applying this kind of digital technology as part of, for instance, smart city initiatives. Could you tell us a bit more about this concept of a smart city and how it can take account of the risks facing people, both as citizens, but also as workers? And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, how can smart city initiatives potentially create incentives that might benefit not just, citizens, but citizens as workers?
Okay, well, I mean, the smart city is really a kind of it's basically a marketing term. There's no one definition of it, but what I guess it refers to is cities that are looking to use the digitalization of their processes to resolve urban problems and improve services. Usually, this relates to security, governance, like e-governance, for example, reducing paperwork, allowing people to do things online. It relates to pollution. So the environment, there's for many cities, that's a criteria. Improving transport, what they call mobility, and so on. Now, the basic idea is that you can measure things, then you can identify inefficiencies, and then having measured these inefficiencies, you can then remedy them. You can find ways of eliminating that waste in the process. And this is, hugely important, I think, because for us as transport workers, because many of our workers work in cities, it's where the bulk of the population, of the world's population now lives in cities, and the proportion is growing. And so this means that what happens in the city, in the smart city, is going to shape the lived experience of much of the world's population in coming decades. Now, our kind of issue with the existing smart city initiatives is really that they're framed in an economic, or a resource optimization framework. It's all about reducing costs, reducing expenditures, reducing waste. But this is a kind of very economistic way of looking at a city. A city is also a lived space, and it's a workplace. We tend to see a focus in smart city initiatives on citizens. They have e-forums and online discussion groups and neighborhood forums and all of this stuff, which is good. I'm not saying that it isn't, but many of us spend a huge amount of our time at work. Particularly those who are in low-paid, informal sector jobs. 60, 70 hours a week is common, and so we can't optimize the city only around economic criteria. because it's very reductionist. The city is a lived space, it's a social space, it's a cultural space. And we think that people should be considering, authorities, companies, citizens should be considering the city as a space for decent work, as a way of, like I was saying before, like underpinning all the other good things that we love about our cities, and that we'd like to improve them upon. Like, there's no point having the best parks in the world in a city and the most beautiful architecture if the people that live there are doing 12, 14-hour days and being paid a pittance. That's an exaggeration, obviously, but it points towards a truth in the way that the kind of smart city is being framed from only one angle. There's also an issue of it being a bit tech deterministic, like, let's measure it and fix it. But, there's always a problem with the fact you can't measure everything. And therefore you can't fix everything with digital tools. And there's, a huge number of issues around data and the way it's measured and what gets measured and so on that experts in that field often discuss. So for us, from the perspective of transport workers, we think that these smart city initiatives should be really looking at a kind of life in the city as consisting of two elements, really. Your leisure time and your work time, and that a decent life, a rights-based life, would have to be based around a consideration of rights in both of those areas. I think mainly in the West, in recent years, we've moved away from concerns about the quality of work and towards, kind of concerns about the existence of work. I think if this is not the right perspective when looking at the city. We should be looking at the quality of jobs, and digitalization should be playing a part in ensuring that. Now, how is it looked at the moment? If I give you an example, many cities that are building a smart city incorporate transport into it's one of the main things in any smart city, is like creating like a kind of an aggregator, an integrator of all the data sources, and allowing passengers to sort of see on their phone different ways, different modes they can use to get from A to B, but according to cost, according to various criteria that they themselves can input. Now, the problem with this is that it tends to operate from the perspective of the operator of the transport system on the one hand, and the passenger on the other. It doesn't consider the bus driver or the train driver or the tram driver, or the other people that carry out functions in an urban transport system. It doesn't consider a food delivery rider, and so on. No one's asked them what they might need or want from a digitalized transport system. So what we are arguing for is really an integrated approach that ensures that people are heard and that their views can be acted upon in order to prevent problems further down the line. As the responsible business guidelines indicate, there's a responsibility to prevent here, and cities should be preventing problems as well. So what do we think the social optimization, what would the socially optimized digitalized city look like? Well, I think it's about the transparency issue that I was mentioning earlier on. The transparency can't just be towards, the sort of top level processes. We need a kind of transparency around work. Which companies are paying tax? What's the environmental record of companies? And some element of this already exists in some places. In China, some of these social credit schemes incorporate some corporate responsibility elements, mainly around like emissions and pollution and customer service and sort of corruption. But you could take that and sort of expand it to allowing workers to rate employers, perhaps, allowing workers to see how many grievances have been raised in a particular workplace, how pay and conditions compare to the average across a city. The exact criteria could be, there's many possibilities there. The point is that we've got to create some kind of transparency going both ways in order to optimize the city in a social way, because you'd be effectively creating a market for decent work by doing this. You'd be attracting workers to the best workplaces and creating an incentive, an external incentive on companies to improve their paying conditions. And so I think this, in conjunction with measures to improve municipal democracy and sustainability of cities, could take us quite some way towards a socially optimized city that embodies decent work.
Thank you, Victor. So much food for thought. I mean, thank you for highlighting these very important needs around transparency, rights-based and integrated approaches, and ensuring that people are heard and consulted in these processes. I wanted to perhaps just touch on one of the points you made regarding decent work, and also, the compelling points you made around the city as a space for decent work, and us needing to ensure that we uphold rights in both the areas of leisure and of work. Could you perhaps elaborate further? And I know we're running slightly out of time, so perhaps spend the next few minutes. I'll combine my two last questions, so to make sure we have some time for audience comments and questions. But around decent work, could you share, what type of policy proposals we might need to ensure a future with decent work? And then perhaps related to that, whether there are currently any alternative rights-based worker-centered solutions to address some of the problems that you've just shared.
Thank you, Maisa. I realise that I've probably been going on a little bit. Apologies to you for that. I mean, fundamentally, I think what we need is regulation that enables people, that underpins everything else. And the base of this is social dialogue, tripartism, and collective bargaining. So the respect of those fundamental rights, because this would enable strong preventative measures to be taken, and would guarantee a holistic approach to the issues raised by digitalization. And this is something that the ILO and the ITUC, amongst others, and ITF within that movement are pushing for. It's the just transition, so in ensuring that workers that suffer, job losses or job transformation as a result of this can get reskilled, retrained, and that they have the social protections outside of that, unemployment and sickness benefits and so on, that enable them to be able to transition from one job to another without serious problems. And this is why the ILO is arguing for a labour protection floor, a set of standards that would protect workers' rights in the sort of transition towards a more fully digitalised economy. Now, at ITF, we've kind of looked at all of these things, and we have some specific policy goals around AI and so on, which fundamentally have to recognise the role that a worker plays in the creation of data, and the fact that these companies need to be regulated. Basically, they need the liability that a digital company has for the impacts of its products on workers needs to be recognised in labour law.
Thank you so much, Victor. Wow, that was, you just really synthesized in a very compelling manner different questions, and in a way that really allows us to actually hand over to the audience. I have a couple follow-up questions. Let's see if we have time for that. But with this, I'd just like to see if there are any questions. I have a question here from Annie. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to collect 2-3 questions, or however many we have. And then, Victor, I'll hand it back to you, and you can address those questions in whichever order you like, just to make sure we can take several if there are several. Annie, I'll start with you. You're saying, Victor mentioned earlier that the format of these changes must be through dialogue and not conflict. And you're asking, how can workers possibly advocate for themselves when there is a power imbalance between worker and employer? Obviously, also something that you've spoken about, Victor, earlier. In particular, now that worker unions have been so gutted and corporate powers mean so much. Following, what are the downsides to workers offensively arguing for their own rights? Thank you, Annie. We have Voltaire, just a comment from Voltaire also that I'll gladly read out while we wait to see if others have any comments or questions also. Voltaire, related to the housing. Okay, I'll see what that question, Majd, if you could just clarify what you mean by that question, I'll read it out in a second. In the meanwhile, to Voltaire's comment, Voltaire says, great insights here. Thank you, Voltaire. We can relate them to the tech demo on WeWork app for workers' well-being and commute time and overtime recording. Also to the panel on workers' co-op owned platforms in Argentina, India, and Africa. So Majd is asking if you can relate the right to housing to labor as well. So I think I'll just pause here with those questions and hand back over to you, Victor.
Thank you. Well, on the first question, I think in relation to being able to advocate for themselves when there is this imbalance, the point is that workers there's always been an imbalance in power in the workplace between the employee and the employer, and the way that they've historically redressed that is by acting collectively, and that is still fundamentally the way in which employees can defend themselves and advocate for themselves in the face of an employer. And we're seeing that in the kind of spontaneous organizing that is taking place in the gig economy, for example. But also, when COVID kicked off, there were spontaneous actions by workers in Amazon, in other companies, demanding personal protective equipment and so on. It's inherent, I would say, in the labour relationship that collective action is the response to all of this. Now, there is a huge problem in particular in countries like the United States and Britain and beyond that, where unions have been decimated by regulation that has really destroyed the fundament of social dialogue and so on. And so, like our colleagues in the ITUC, what we're arguing for is for the reconstruction of that set of regulations to reinvigorate social dialogue and put it at the center. It's not that, as you said, that necessarily because arguing offensively, as you put it, is a bad thing. If there's a great offense done, my personal perspective is that that there's a right. I think it's in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, isn't it? A right to rebellion against tyranny. And so I think it's just that for society as a whole, the costs of conflict are high. And so if we can get to a situation where we can mitigate those costs for employers, for employees, for society as a whole, then everyone benefits. And that's what we should be aiming for. The other question on relating the right to housing to labour rights, I mean, clearly the right to housing is fundamental. And in a situation like the smart city, there is an example, a recent report on India, for example, where the accusation was that the measurements that were being made in the smart cities in India didn't incorporate the slums, and so you're violating people's right by just simply not ignoring them. And so, for me, if we're going to have decent work, if we're going to have a decent life in the city of the future, obviously housing is one of the fundamentals for that, but so is decent work. And on the comment on the WeWork app, I've heard about this app and I'm looking forward to looking into it. I think it's a great initiative, and one that we will definitely be keeping an eye on.
Thank you so much, Victor. And thank you, everyone, for your compelling questions. I'm just going to check if there is one or two final questions for the last couple of minutes before we wrap up. Let me just double check. Yes, we have one more question. Victor, Trishna is asking what the consumers movement can do to be an ally for workers, especially because using apps such as Uber and Amazon have become almost indispensable to live without. And I'm just going to pause for 1 sec to see if there's any other final question before I hand it over to you, Victor, to answer this question, make any other final remarks you may wish to share.
Thank you.
Victor.
I mean, that is a great question, Trishna. I mean, fundamentally, I think to resolve the problems inherent in this application of technology in the economy, we need to balance convenience and cost with decent work. And the only way to do that is to enter into dialogue with each other. So I think consumers organizations in different countries ought to be talking to the workers, the associations that exist for workers, or for the unions where they exist that represent those gig economy workers, but also, beyond the gig economy, unions in food delivery and so on, in order to find that balance. Because the consumers are also workers, maybe not in the same sectors, but often, they are. And so I think it's crucial that we have a very broad social dialogue, across citizens' organizations, environmental organizations. The challenges posed by digitalization are not just challenges of the workplace. They are challenges about power and the nature of power and transparency in society as a whole. And that has impacts in the workplace that are very specific. But the challenges are such that everyone needs to talk about this. Everyone needs to be aware of the challenges. And then we've got to, together as a society, come up with the solutions and the regulation, the rules and the duties and responsibilities of all parts of that system in order to ensure a brighter future for everyone.
Thank you, Victor, so much. That is a beautiful note to end this compelling fireside chat on. So I would like to just wrap up. I think a big thanks to you, Victor, for sharing with us these compelling examples and much food for thought. I hope that, and I trust that the audience has found this just as fascinating. Thank you for insisting on the importance of dialogue and inclusion and consultation of workers and upholding their labor and other human rights, and how companies might, mitigate the kind of risks that you've been talking about, and how they can act to ensure that they uphold their responsibilities under the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. So before we end here, just for the benefit of the audience, you will find, I believe our friends from Access Now will share with you both my email address as well as Victor's email address. If you have any follow-up questions or would like to get in touch with us, please don't hesitate. And our colleagues will also share with you the report on litigating labor relationships in the gig economy that I was referring to earlier. We at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center published this report late last year to demonstrate how workers are using the courts to assert their core labor rights in the examples that Victor and I were mentioning earlier. This has been a great pleasure. I am proud to say that we are closing with 2 seconds to spare. Thank you very much to RightsCon and to the Aggregators for bringing us together. And big thanks to you, Victor.
Thank you. Goodbye.